Welcome, everyone, to this session on building blocks for a circular future, organized by the Ministry of the Environment of Finland, the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management of the Netherlands, and in partnership with Green Building Council Finland, Holland Circular Hotspot, Nordic Circular Hotspot, the UN Environment, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. My name's Cindy, and I'm excited to be moderating this session for you today on one of the most critical sectors for the circular economy, the built environment. So today's built environment, it uses almost half the materials extracted annually, generates significant greenhouse gas emissions, and is expanding rapidly, particularly in the global south. So to ensure that our citizens' future built environment needs can still be met without blowing the carbon budget, we have to think about circular building design and material management. As we reported in our 2019 paper, Completing the Picture, solving the climate crisis will require more than just a renewable energy transition. Now, the Foundation's work in this space leverages the expertise of our partners at Arup and Biomimicry 3.8, and we work with our network of about 300 organizations trying to transform their built environment assets to be more aligned with circularity. However, it's important for us to note that if we focus only on circular materials and individual buildings design, that won't be enough to transform the whole sector. We need a system-level transformation that takes into account new ways of investing, different types of policy, new urban design, all the way down to the neighborhood level, as I know Julia Okach will speak to later on. So we have an impressive lineup of different types of individuals here to share their perspectives with you. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to the Minister of Environment of the Netherlands to give the opening words.
Thank you, Cindy, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to open this session on the built environment here in the beautiful city of Helsinki. It's my first visit, so I've been quite impressed by what I saw when driving from location A to B today. I hope to visit it in a more private capacity sometime soon. It's very important and so necessary for us all to have a session on the built environment, because after all, this is a sector that employs millions of people in the EU alone. And it's also a sector that will grow substantially in the upcoming years. And there's a huge demand for new housing and for new infrastructure. In my country alone, we need to build more than 1 million houses by 2030. When you think about how this will increase the demand for building materials, combined with the fact that the sector is responsible for almost 40% of all carbon emissions globally, then the answer is clear. The business as usual is no longer an option. And to tackle this, in the Netherlands, we've made the built environment a priority in our new national circular economy program. But construction value chains often cross national borders. So for circular construction to reach its full potential on a scale that will ensure a sustainable future, we must work together intensively, in addition to stepping up our national efforts. We need international cooperation, and in order to do so, we need to boost knowledge and innovation development. We have to identify and share best practices for policies, but also for building methods that benefit circularity in the sector. And we have to ensure alignment and harmonization of norms and standards, which will enable more circularity in construction. And the good news is, for all of us, circularity in building already exists. And we will see some nice examples of that today. And this session will highlight some inspiring developments that are making the building and infrastructure sectors more sustainable. What new policy developments are worth noting? How can we extend the lifespan of building materials? How can we design in a smart way to contribute to more circularity? Today's session includes videos that illuminate good practices, and one of them is from my own country, from the Netherlands, and it shows the CO2 performance ladder, a tool which gives sustainable contractors an advantage in the procurement process. Evidence shows that this is also an effective tool that helps organizations and businesses reduce their carbon emissions. We also have best practice videos from Finland, I understand, and from South Africa, so I'm looking forward to see them. And I think it's interesting for us to learn more about all the different approaches to circularity in construction sectors around the world and to hear the perspectives of the panelists. But first, I would like to hand over to Johanna Damski, the Permanent Secretary of the Finnish Ministry of the Environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Heinen. It is a pleasure to be here and to be with you all here in Finland. I'm Juhani Damski from the Ministry of Environment of Finland. It is really a great pleasure to have you all in Finland. As you know, Finland has been leading in sustainable buildings and construction program under the UNEP's One World network for almost 8 years. The SBC program has had its focus on a circular built environment, and this is something that we are delivering also in the future to much, and this is something that we have to do together. Continuity is also a very important one when we are talking about circularity, and also continuity of these sessions. And this session actually continues a series of construction sessions in the World Circular Economy Forums, starting from the very first forum in Helsinki 2017. And already since 2017, we've been focusing on built environment and its connection to the circularity. Our priority in Finland, the circular economy, is very high. And the policy agenda for Finland in the sector of built environment is also very high, and the circularity, to take that into account, remains to be so. Our work to promote circularity at the global level will also continue in One Planet Network under the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. As we all know, and as was nicely remarked by Minister, there are endless possibilities. And I'm sure that after this session and complementing accelerator sessions tomorrow, we will all be much more aware of the environmental and economic possibilities that circular economy can provide for the built environment. And we are here together for doing this. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and welcome to Finland and welcome to this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary. To give us a state of play of where the sector is today, I'd like to welcome Janes Potočnik, co-chair of the International Resource Panel, and Julia Okac, the director from Systemic, on stage to deliver their keynote.
Thanks. Good day, everybody. Can we just have the slides, please? Thanks. Actually, we have split the session with my good colleague, Julia, to 2 parts. I will put you in the context, and she will lead you and also explain why actually construction, or better to say, the housing sector, is so important. And Julia will go more in detail of some of the things she was working on. So, this is the biomass of life. So you see very clearly here how much is the biomass of humans, wild birds, wild mammals. But that's actually not what I want. So if you compare it to the biomass of other living beings, fungi, archaea, then viruses, plants, you see that actually animals, if we belong there, are a rather small part of that. But the core message which I want to share with you, if you compare the whole biomass of life with the anthropogenic biomass, that's the biomass created by humans, we are already surpassing that. So you see here concrete, bricks, aggregates, metals, asphalt, and other. And by the way, the housing sector is pretty much contributing to that part of the story. If the trends will continue, in 2040 we can expect that the right column will be 3 times the height of the left column. So we have all learned that practically everybody has heard about the donut compass for the human prosperity. And we know that the inner part is the basic human needs, which we have, which is of course expanding due to economic development. And also, by the way, also the population is growing. And the outer part are the planetary limits. We are surpassing those planetary boundaries. The latest data are actually showing us that the things are worse than initially when this was identified. But of course, if we look to those questions, then we can find that the situation, when you look it through the country story, it's pretty much different. So you have countries like Malawi, which are far from that they would be surpassing planetary boundaries. But of course, they are also not well meeting the social needs. Then to the China, Belgium, Australia, where each country has basically overshooting the planetary boundaries more. But let me now integrate that a bit in the story which we are covering in the International Resource Panel. So it's the story which is linked to the natural resource management. When we say natural resources, what we talk about? Biomass, metals, fossil fuels, and non-metallic minerals. We call everything materials. So materials, it's everything extracted from the earth. And then on the top of that, you have water and land. So that constitutes the story of the natural resources. If we look to the trends, this is from the Global Resource Outlook 2019, then we can do three simple conclusions. One is that global material use has more than tripled in the last 50 years. It has almost doubled on per capita basis, which means that majority of the tripling can actually be devoted, linked to the economic development, but of course, the growth of population is also an important factor. And finally, which is really interesting fact, it's material productivity. This is the black solid line, which is efficiency of materials per unit of GDP, which is, by the way, increasing in all the countries. How the hell is possible that it's decreasing on a global level from the year 2000? Because there was a structural shift. The things which you are buying, wearing, were before more produced in resource-efficient countries. Now they are like Europe, like Japan. Now they are more produced in resource-less efficient countries. And of course, this has consequences on the resource use. So when we have analyzed the impacts of the materials in value chain of extraction and processing, we found out that 90% of land-related biodiversity loss and water stress can be devoted to that. You can see here, it's practically connected to the green part, so to the biomass story. Second, 50% of global climate change impacts and 1/3 of the air pollution health impacts. So if you buy a car, park it, don't use it for the whole life. You have created 1/3 of pollution because resources needs to be extracted and car needs to be produced. So if the trends would continue, global material consumption, it's predicted to double till 2060. So in next bit less than 40 years. That's why our conclusion in the IRP is very simple. We need to decouple. We need to decouple well-being growth, economic growth from the resource use, and both from the environmental impacts. Which leads me then to the conference why we are sitting here. It's the conference, as you know, about circular economy, and circular economy is simply instrument to deliver decoupling. But you should also see it as a kind of normalization of our economics. So it's basically part of a bigger economic, societal, and cultural transformation. If we want an economy to be aligned with European Green Deal Sustainable Development Goals, it should be circular economy. None of other economies actually fit into that. When we look to the circularity, then we can see that there are different layers of circularity and understanding. Everybody in the room probably have heard that when we talk about circularity, too many times we are landing in recycling. But there is more than that. If you can go from repurpose, reuse, repair, refurbish, reduce strategies, then to refuse and rethink. So how can we basically do the things differently, which is pretty much overlooked. So since I was starting the whole story of circularity in European Union, at least when it comes to political initiatives, our first initiatives were focusing on waste, pretty much, how to improve that. Then the recent commission went to the area of products. We are not yet in the real system change, if we are honest. So if I translate that to today's topic, managing waste related to buildings is our attention. Optimizing construction and building is in our attention. Efficient and balanced spaced and optimized buildings utilization, it's not yet. So we need to connect the things. We need to connect the questions. And when we are doing that, one of the essential questions you should ask is, actually we don't need buildings like we don't need cars. We need mobility. We need space to live. So it's really important that we understand and that we design our thinking and logic through the human needs. And those who are most resource intensive, those who are most impacting the climate change biodiversity loss are nutrition, housing, mobility, and consumer goods. And then you have the supporting very resource efficient systems which are enabling us that, which are using directly nature, energy, materials, innovation, digitalization, all that connected in a very important part. So built environment, it's part of the core problems which are causing climate change and biodiversity loss, full stop. And these are the last two slides. This is actually a teaser. It's from incoming report, Global Resource Outlook. We will release it in the beginning of 2024. We are not looking anymore through the sectorial logic. We are looking through the needs of the humans. And we have modeled everything and connect everything. And you can see on the left-hand side how actually the built environment, which is the green part, it's contributing here to the climate change. What are the trends? And on the right-hand side, how much it's contributing to the biodiversity loss. And if you look at high-income countries' story, high middle-income country story, middle low-income country story, and on the right-hand side, low-income country story. So we will depict the whole story of how the things are connected to human needs and depict it how it's connected to the fairness and equity and what needs to be done. And Julia will now talk more about that, what could concretely be done in the housing sector. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yannis. So yes, let's look more closely on the actual built environment. How does this logic apply? And of course, the essential question Yannis leaves me with now is how to meet the essential human need of quality housing in the most energy and resource efficient way. And that's why we're all here. And it comes to, as no surprise to you, that a fundamental solution in our mind is the circular economy and the deep systemic circular economy, as Yannis has just alluded to. And I think most of you will know this, but maybe we have a few newbies to circular built environment. So I just pulled out one framework that I really like, and I want to say there are many different toolkits and frameworks for the circular built environment that are great and ready to use. This one maps particularly nicely to those dimensions that we use, so I like it. And just really quickly to recap, right? So the pillars of a circular built environment strategy would be first, build nothing, try to reuse where you can. Increase long-term value, right? It's the adaptability, repair, and so on. Leaner design, which means, for example, leaner steel beams, or also concrete that uses less cement and so on. And then, of course, the cleaner materials, which would be recycled materials, renewable materials, where you can. So that's kind of the basic, I think, that most of us know. This is sort of what the circular built environment does. And it's great that we have so many frameworks, and I think they've really improved since sort of my last time here, which was 4 or 5 years ago. And luckily, we haven't only improved the frameworks, but also the actual construction or reconstruction. These are just a few pictures from Europe of really great pilots of efficient structures, structures made out of timber, of reused materials, and so on. Everything that I think most of us connect with circular construction. And I look forward to complementing the slide with a bit more international view, maybe, after today. So these are just European examples. That is not to say that only Europe has good examples, quite the opposite. The question is, though, if we have all these amazing innovations going on, and actually there are also a few statistics that do say every dwelling is getting more efficient, energy efficient in this case, on average in every country in Europe, I'm not sure globally, but why is it that still overall, this is a global view, housing is growing so fast in its resource use, and it's actually growing faster than any other provisioning system or sector, how you want to see it. So clearly we have two diverging trends here. We are making progress in circularity, and we need to acknowledge that. And really, it's amazing what we're seeing, but it's not really hitting home yet, you could say. And I'd say there are two reasons. You can split that up in different categories of rationale, but it's like basically scope and scale, right? So if we look at scale, we see that obviously it's not mainstream yet. It's not like every building, renovated or constructed will incorporate all these amazing principles yet. I won't dive super deep in that because I think we have an expert on the panel, or several experts on the panel later, and the Arabs and metabolics and so on of this world really know all about this. I will talk about the systemic scope that is missing, I think, I think we have analyzed this in basically any climate policy, resource strategy, and so on, and that we see investment strategies also very importantly, and very much taking up the logic that Yannis just explained about the systemic view that now we need to apply. And that is really right. It's those two dimensions, really, when it comes to better utilization. How do we get to build nothing? Doesn't sound very attractive, building nothing, but there's actually a lot behind that. And to allude to that systemic view a bit more, what does that mean in the built environment, right? So we have looked at how do urban areas look like at the moment. We looked at Europe, but we should do it, over the globe. I do think this is applicable to many areas. And we see that there's a lot of underutilization going on, or, misuse of space. We can use many terms, where really ultimately buildings and infrastructure, and therefore their material, is just not being used very well, right? So even if we made it super circular and recycled, they're still being underutilized. There's material that's effectively wasted. And these are just a few sort of illustrative key stats, right? So we see that a lot of our built environment is underoccupied, so rooms are just not being used. Some is not occupied at all, it's vacant, maybe decaying. About half of our built environment is sprawling out, so really inefficient in its composition. And then obviously that flips over then on the other side, where we have overcrowding or missing houses, or what we call the housing crisis. And that just causes a lot of excessive material and energy demand. We see that, for example, the single-family housing areas use on average about 50% more materials and twice the energy, also because they're more underutilized, but it goes over beyond just the buildings directly, right? It will cause us infrastructure that is much more extensive, much more material intensive. So roads and inefficient space use are up to 10 times the length, and this is European Commission statistics. It's not something we have measured, and that also then causes social impacts, right? So, for example, a lot of settlements miss or lose the minimum density to be accessible services, which then causes more transport emissions and so on. So it's really about combining this utilization view with what I think more classically is being perceived as circular construction. And what we have done, we have looked at if now you applied sort of the perfect circularity to every element on its own without improving the system, how far would we get? And we modeled that for cement and steel and so on. I'm not showing all of that, to my great pity. because we don't have time, but it's actually interesting because you can really see the big emissions gap. Like you just can't, you can't get to the ultimate outcome without the systems view. And then we have applied the systems view and basically, thought, okay, if we take sort of what is going on now in terms of how we use space and utilize buildings towards sort of a theoretical optimum, what would happen, and we saw that you can save about 45% of annual construction emissions, so embodied emissions in road and building construction. And obviously that is something we need very urgently, because it's probably no secret to you that most of the materials used in the built environment are really hard to decarbonize or de-impactize in any other way. It's really hard to make low carbon cement if possible at all. And it's also quite difficult to recycle it, right? So it's really about those other more systemic levers. Luckily, even though they're not necessarily called circular, we could find quite a few examples where this is being applied quite nicely. So the sort of more classical circular economy with that good space use, many of these examples are known to many of you. I think Switzerland, Barcelona, these are famously well-managed environments. I think Freiburg is a very interesting example because it's actually, this Vauban area is a suburban area which reuses buildings, but at the same time has this density and circular space use and repair cafes and shared shops and so on. So really a systemic view, which doesn't very often happen in suburban environments. We had trouble finding examples, so I think this is a very interesting one. And we found lots of other sort of pocket examples all over Europe, and again, I look forward to expanding these example set a bit beyond Europe. None of them is perfect yet, but very interesting enough to really get inspired and then also inspire our investment strategies, legislation, and so on. And wow, I have 1 minute left, so it's quite well timed. I will end with this, but there's still quite a lot of information here. So the conclusion is obviously not to do either or, right? It's to do it together. And actually, we have seen in many examples that this more sort of urban view, circular space use, whatever term you want to use, and the more classic circular construction techniques, they can really boost each other. And it's really, while it sometimes sounds a little bit vague and big, when they go hand in hand, there is a lot of momentum being created. And maybe to go into that just for my remaining 40 seconds. So you see that many of the actions we need to do to boost the circular space use are also probably very known to you as classic circular construction strategies, right? So we are revitalizing city centers wherever compact living is already existent or has high potential. And to do that, obviously, we need a lot of like urban planning and investment and things that go beyond sort of the classic circular agenda. But we also need the quality upgrading of buildings, the retrofitting, the repurposing of vacant buildings. There's a lot around upfill and infill of lower density areas, so they can become sort of interactive, vibrant hubs. Someone made a fun calculation, I thought, and calculated how you could accommodate the whole of Brussels' projected future population on its rooftops by sort of timber rooftop extensions, and that would apparently, space-wise, be quite easily possible without sealing any extra land. And we have a lot about adapting under-occupied buildings. It's maybe a bit more niche solution, right? So big buildings where few people live, can you make them a bit more adaptable? So, when the population changes, you can inhabit them with families or single persons or so on. There's also an area that is often overlooked, which is about right-sizing declining areas. So a lot of Europe's and probably global, especially smaller cities, will shrink. And I think most of us have been in a place where there are a lot of empty and decaying buildings. It has a spiraling effect. There's a lot about right-sizing and purposeful deconstruction, which again, it is an urban revitalization and space use agenda, but it's also a very sort of classic deconstruction, circular construction agenda. And then there is the whole part around creating spaces for local businesses, right? Connecting to other circular activities, repair cafes, sustainable hospitality, and so on. And of course, this massive nature agenda. So in order to make this better space use, more dense areas viable and attractive, you need better nature in cities, obviously, which is a very circular solution. But also the other way around. In order to enable nature to come into cities, there's no other solution than being more efficient with your building space. Otherwise, you simply don't have space for nature, right? So all of these are very much sort of investment areas that often fall under recovery or infrastructure or urban revitalization investments, and often are the multi-billion sort of investment projects. But they're also very attractive because they have a natural business case. If you revitalize cities and use your space better, it often ends in better productivity and so on. And it channels a lot of investment in this type of activity, which we believe could also be a really important boost to scale what we call circular construction. So it's worth thinking those two things together. And I think in terms of communities, would maybe be interesting to bring this crowd together with a more sort of urban planning and architectural crowd at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Janets. Thank you, Julia.
Shall we just stay?
Yeah, I'd like to welcome our other panelists. We're going to be having a bit of a discussion based a little bit around what we heard in the keynote, as well as some other emerging themes. So please, could I welcome on stage, we have Julia Okach already from Systemic, Aishwarya Iyer from the Yale University, Roland Hunziker from the WBCSD, and Ashraf Kamal, professor from the Housing and Building National Research Center in Egypt. Please welcome. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for taking time to be here today. We just heard a really compelling case for why we are here today, gathered to talk about the built environment sector, the impacts that it's having on planetary boundaries, how we have to take this systemic approach when we think about circularity as a solution space. To kickstart our conversation, Roland, I wanted to maybe go to you and ask you a very simple question that Julia kind of already alluded to. So if circular solutions exist, and we're already seeing some of them being piloted, and there's a lot of potential, why are we not seeing more of them happening already today in the sector?
Thank you very much, Cindy, for having me, and thank you for the great introduction so far. Probably we're not getting there because of exactly what Janes has explained to us. We're not looking at system change today. We're still trying to fix incremental things rather than looking at what are our needs and how can we deliver to those needs in a more efficient way. But to go maybe a little bit more into what are some of these barriers that we see, especially for circularity. Actually tomorrow, as part of the Circular Buildings Coalition, we will issue a report that has looked at some of these systemic barriers. It focuses on Europe, and it's looking at these numbers as well. We know that about half of resources are extracted for the built environment, and it's 40% of CO2 emissions, but it is also a major contributor to GDP. But what keeps us back are issues around not taking a holistic view of projects. And what do we mean by a holistic view? Do we look across the whole life cycle when we invest, when we build, or even when we refurbish buildings? And that lack of a holistic whole life cycle view shows up in what we have researched, 3 key barriers. One is around the issue of ownership. So if we look at ownership of built assets, it often passes from one to the next and inhibits us from looking at optimizing the solutions across the whole life cycle. And we could also apply different models if we did that. When we look at buildings, they're made up of many, many different components, and we could start looking at different ownership models even across those different components. Another issue is then linked to that around the financing. Buildings are made up of so many valuable materials and components, yet we completely depreciate them arbitrarily over a certain time, and we're not looking at, for example, what is salvage value that we could harness. And again, it's because in the way we finance, we're not looking at the value that gets created. And we could even look at how do we depreciate individual components so that we can take all that into our financing and incentivize better practices. And the last issue that we have looked at is also the lack of material marketplaces and incentives to actually reuse materials. There are many, many interesting projects going on, and you showed several of them on your slides, where companies are trying to do this, small startups are trying to do this. But really, to get over these system barriers, we need that approach where a city and its stakeholders, its construction industry come together and say, so how do we organize this space? Where we do this? We need materials that become available at the moment where we're building somewhere else. So we need that whole ecosystem to work out. So these are roughly 3 areas that we have investigated. Now I've spoiled a little bit the beans for tomorrow, but please do join us for the detailed presentation of that. And I'd also like to particularly thank our partners, Metabolic and Circle Economy, who have led this work, and World GBC, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Arup, and ourselves, who have provided a lot of input. So maybe just taking again a step back, and then I'll stop for my first intervention. I think ultimately it comes down to 2 things that we need to do, is building on what you said, better to do nothing than to do something inefficient. We need to look at these full life cycle impacts. We call it whole life carbon. We need to understand for everything we do, what is the whole life carbon of that project or asset, or even on a neighborhood scale. And the next thing is we need to look at what is the life cycle costing of that. And if we do the 2 things, we optimize for carbon, but we also optimize for cost, and we reduce material use. So there's relatively simple things we can all do that help us overcome these barriers.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Roland. We had individual chats with all of you prior to today, and there were a lot of these solutions that you spoke of that were kind of being brought up. One area that came up in some of the conversations was around legislation. We have a video on the new Construction Act of Finland that can set the context for that part of the conversation.
The goal of the circular economy is to keep resources in circulation. In the built environment, this means high-quality life cycles for building materials and extended building service life. In Finland, the new Construction Act enters into force in 2025. The Act promotes circular economy in the built environment in 4 main ways: low-carbon construction, life cycle quality, reuse and recycling, and digitalization. The new Act steers towards low-carbon construction by accounting for both negative greenhouse gas emissions and positive climate benefits throughout the life cycle of buildings. In practice, the building permit application must include a climate declaration, which includes the carbon footprint and handprint assessment. Limit values will be set for carbon footprints for major building types. The assessment also includes embodied carbon, which will promote the use of reused and recycled materials in building. The Act also promotes the life cycle qualities of buildings. In the future, buildings must be designed to be adaptable and in use for a long time. The ability to dismantle and reuse materials must be taken into account. Detailed criteria to to assess these qualities are to be developed. The Act supports the market for deconstructed components and materials by requiring digital pre-demolition declarations. This improves statistics for construction and demolition waste and increases opportunities for reuse and recycling. The Act provides the foundations for digitalization. The use of building information modeling will be the primary process for design and for building permits. Up-to-date and easily accessible information about buildings and materials promotes circularity. Finland is aiming for a comprehensive built environment information system by 2030. We all benefit from the circular economy in the built environment. It mitigates climate change, reduces waste, and creates new business opportunities for the future.
Great. Yeah, let's have some applause. So there we just saw a bit of an example speaking to some of the points you mentioned, Roland, on this life cycle approach, creating that marketplace. Julia, wondering, turning to you, what do you think is the role of legislation in driving circular economy more broadly in the built environment?
Such a big question. I mean, maybe just commenting on what we saw directly, I think that's an amazing initiative and really should be seen as leadership, well, over Europe, probably over the world. I do think, especially speaking to investors, this whole idea around embodied carbon resonates quite well. Not in the sense that people think it's easy, but it's fairly straightforward, right? People are getting used to carbon and climate regulation, and then embodied carbon is sort of one step further, but it makes sense to most investors. And I do think from what I see now, it is what is most driving a circular uptake, at least sort of in the real estate infrastructure investment area, that they might not call it circular economy, but they say embodied carbon targets are really hard to meet. How do we do it? And then, you know, people like us come in and say, well, actually, if you retrofit it instead of new building, you know, it's called value-add investment in that world, you can save a lot of embodied carbon. It's like, okay, and that really triggers this rethinking towards circular economy. I guess to include that dimension that I was alluding to most in my presentation, ideally we would, you know, gradually, but quite fast, expand this embodied carbon thinking to a sort of a per person utilization perspective. Because currently, basically anything around energy efficiency or material efficiency will be per square meter, which just benefits enormously. If I now build my 300 square meter luxury house and insulate it really well, I will have like amazing scores on paper, but I'm still using like triple the energy than, you know, someone living like in a small apartment. And that, you know, in statistics, I will appear as like the good doer, and that person will appear as like, oh, you know, these like low-income houses are really badly insulated. That's a problem, we should insulate them, but you know, that sort of guilt narrative I think is really problematic. And the other aspect would be to include some sort of infrastructure view, which alludes, you know, around location, because again, I can build a perfect house, but if I build it somewhere and then the council or the borough or whatever has to build 3 more roads to service that, which is all pure asphalt, then, you know, okay, my statistic is really well, but the city statistic around that is like really poorly, versus, you know, chances are I built a very conventional house with terrible embodied carbon, but in a good location, the overall system performance would be better. So yeah, those are 2 aspects I think that we need to keep integrating.
Yeah, there's a question of what do we measure and what's that context,
Exactly.
and
the pricing.
Yeah, exactly. And how does legislation play into that? Aishwarya, we also talked a little bit about legislation. I think you had an interesting perspective on when that should be driving versus maybe taking a back seat. Do you want to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, no, that was a very interesting video, and I agree with everything Yulia mentioned. I do want to bring up the fact that when we talk about circular economy, as the video showed, we do talk about reuse a lot. And one of the things that I also wanted to bring up was that when we talk about reuse, we need to think about the way that we design buildings, the way we create buildings, and usually right now, the way buildings are being constructed, oftentimes it's too logistically as well as economically expensive to really extract that material at the end of the life cycle, as many people already mentioned. And I feel like design for disassembly needs to be something that we think about. And legislation is key here, because when we talk about design for disassembly, it needs to translate across the entire life cycle of the building. It needs to begin from the production of the materials. It needs to be a part of the design. It needs to be maintained properly by the people who own the building. And then it needs to also be considered when the building is being demolished or deconstructed. So that is one thing that globally, I think, needs to be considered when making legislation, in order to push that narrative and making sure that that is something that gets taken into account. But more to your point about the differences in where legislation should maybe be pushing and in places where legislation should maybe be learning from the existing state of the art or the knowledge that exists. So I feel like there is a significant difference in the global north versus the global south. And in this particular case, what ends up happening is in the global south, as well as in a lot of indigenous communities, people have been for centuries, for decades, been living with and in harmony with natural rhythms. They've been using natural materials, bio-based materials. And currently, most of the low and middle income countries are thinking of going towards a more cementitious or very traditionally developed looking sort of model for all their cities and every place that they're developing. I feel like there is a significant wealth of knowledge in the existing traditional building methods that exist in these countries. While it may not be perfect for all the size and scale of buildings as well as the facilities that we look for in today's world, that's where technology can intervene and improve on that. So in the global north, I feel like legislation needs to push the idea for circularity, but in the global south, maybe we need to learn a little bit from the traditional methods, build upon that, improve upon that, and then maybe use legislation which learns that to push something forward in more of the urban areas in those countries.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I do think there's an important conversation to be had in general about the differences in the built environment between the global north and the global south. We know that the global north largely has a lot of the building stock existing that we'll need in the future, whereas in the global south, a lot still of the new build needs to occur. To kind of take us into that space a little bit on what do you need to consider when thinking about new builds and circular economy? We have a video from South Africa that we'll take a look at next.
Hempcrete is a building material made from the woody core of the hemp plant mixed with lime and water. It's a sustainable alternative to traditional building materials, responsible for a significant amount of carbon emissions. And it's gaining popularity as a circular achievement due to its unique properties and applications. Firstly, hempcrete is a renewable resource. Hemp plants grow quickly and requires minimal water and pesticides, making it an ideal crop for sustainable farming. The plant absorbs large amounts of carbon dioxide during its growth cycle. The woody core, which is typically discarded, is used to make hempcrete. Secondly, hempcrete is a highly energy efficient material. It has excellent insulating properties, which means buildings constructed with hempcrete requires less energy for heating and cooling, reducing energy consumption and carbon emissions. Thirdly, hempcrete is a circular material, meaning it can be reused or recycled 100%. Unlike traditional concrete, which is difficult to recycle and often ends up in landfills, hempcrete can be crushed and used as a soil conditioner, returning valuable nutrients to the earth. Furthermore, hemp farming and construction with hempcrete provide employment opportunities for rural communities. It also reduces the dependency on fossil fuels, Good example is our local designed mobile end processing and decortication unit, which will start processing rural communities as of from July this year. Between our farming operation and block manufacturing plant, we have created 28 jobs this fall. Our studies have shown that adding hempcrete to soil can increase water holding capacity by up to 48%, improve soil aeration and drainage, and boost nutrient availability. Hempcrete can act as a slow-release fertilizer. Our initial lab studies have shown that our hempcrete has a 53% potency in comparison to our agricultural one. Further testing is still ongoing. A thought to the panel. For us as a society to make a real impact on climate change, we must scale solutions like the implementation of hempcrete in the construction sector, similar to the scale of the Harrington Street project here in Cape Town.
Great. So that was an exciting example about hempcrete from South Africa. That's one solution that people are taking on board when we're thinking about building new and circular economy. Ashraf, can I ask you, what do you think are other considerations or key considerations that we should be taking when we're building new?
I think in my, first of all, thank you for giving the opportunity to being here. Thank you for the government of Finland. In fact, in our institute, Housing and Building Research Center, that we are the technical arm of the government. We are affiliated to the government, but we are following the research-based and applied research-based method in our work. So, we have developed applied research in some arid regions in Egypt. Let's say it's the far south to Egypt, nearby Sudan, where it's a very arid zone. It's temperature reaches 56 degrees Celsius in summer, and humidity is only 8%. So it's very hot and very dry. So it's very sensitive to building materials. We have. I'm not saying inventing, but we are working with the local material with some nanotechnology development to make it appropriate for the living conditions. We have a site there and a field lab that we have testing and measurements all over the year, and we have developed like a cluster, a community. Out of limestones and crushed stones in the field and sandstones. And we succeeded so far to reduce the internal temperature by 20 degrees, from 56 to 36, with only using the material and doubling the wall and wall cavities. And we have several examples to be built. This is also for new construction, because we have there a city that made of the business as usual tradition with concrete and blocks, and I can say that it's city of the ghosts. Nobody can live there because it's horrible to work with this environment. But rather, our project is not only on the building side, but on the urban heat island. The urban planner will know this terminology, that the temperature decreased by 20 and the humidity increased by 30%. Wow. So it's now we are achieving more or less a comfort zone that we are building on for the future.
That's excellent. So material innovation, in a way, is...
It's all the material by the local site.
Yeah.
I know it's a challenging spot. Of course, the country is moving ahead on building new construction with the traditional way.
Yeah.
That I can say the train is moving rapidly. We cannot stop. So we thought for another field that we put our research and our efforts there, and it succeeded. The matter now is building the business model to be approved. And we are on the process of this, so that we can approve the measurements of the environment into the building permit as part of the National Climate Strategy that has been issued last year, and the indices that we are aiming to apply by the year 2035.
That's excellent. I think it's a good point to also draw in this perspective of how do you make those connections between what you're doing in terms of circularity in the built environment and what are your other ambitions, for instance, for climate in...
We are dreamers, but we are dreaming practically. So we need to translate our dreams into reality. Otherwise, as previous researches since 50 years are being done perfectly and put on the shelf.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not practically applied.
Yeah, and speaks to Aishwarya's point earlier as well of using the kind of local knowledge already. What do we know? And that context, where are we? To that point on thinking about how do we link circularity to national determined contributions or anything else, Julia, do you have any other thoughts on what kind of linkages should we be making, could we be making, are people making?
Yeah, I have many thoughts. I wouldn't say they're concluded yet, but so we discussed back and forth in our bubble, and I'd be really interested also in any opinion in the conversations after. Is like, how much do we need something like a national, European, global is probably a bit big, but built environment strategy, vision, purpose, right? So, I mean, what do we want from our built environment, from society, as to Yannis's point, that ultimately this is about, supplying human needs in a very efficient way. And what I see this advancing a little bit. People are talking about housing crisis, unaffordability, environment on this side. But it's a bit like, oh, we have this city, population is growing, we need to build X million homes. And it's like, why? You also have like a bunch of cities that are declining. Do we just like write them off? Is our implicit assumption that we just want a country with just big cities? I mean, I'm German, so, traditionally we pride ourselves on having like a balance of different types of cities. So is that just our assumption? Are we just building new and these others decline? So there doesn't seem to be like a vision of, as you say, we have a built environment that's largely there. What do we want it to be? Do we try to like have it well utilized? Do we try to have like big cities, small cities? Do you see what I mean? So what do we think is the built environment that will actually serve us best in wherever we want to be in 10 years? In terms of climate, but also other things, right? Innovation, what types of urban environments do we want to have, or also rural environments? So I think there needs to be a bit of like an integration of what do we want from our built environment, and then how can we optimize for that through, circular new construction, retrofit, all the levers that we have. On the other hand, I also acknowledge that it's a massive field and it's very hard to make like one strategy on a, even on a city level, let alone a national level or a global level, because who would have the authority to do like one strategy on the global level? Like that's difficult in terms of legitimacy. But I do still think that we're just too fragmented in this city needs that, here we need that, here we have housing crisis, here we build, here we decline, and it's a bit of a chaos.
Yeah, maybe a bit more goal setting or clear at least.
Yeah.
If we don't have even if we don't have a universal, what's the ideal built environment, but what are the things that components, indicators of a good circular built environment?
Yeah, I agree. Or even just the type of conversation that we have a built environment to service certain goals, right? A happy society, productivity, innovation, not just short-term decisions about where people live tomorrow, kind of.
Absolutely. I feel like it brings into, again, this kind of systemic lens, and we need the public and the private sectors to be playing into this. One area that we've not touched on yet, and conscious of time, is public procurement. We have a video still from the Netherlands that I think the Dutch minister talked to earlier, so if we can play that, have a bit of a chat.
The CO2 Performance Ladder is a sustainability tool. It is both a procurement tool and a management tool. The CO2 Performance Ladder is a working method for us, a management system to ensure that we as a company are also actively working on making our business more sustainable. The main success factors of this CO2 Performance Ladder are that at low cost, an enormous amount of avoided CO2 emissions is achieved. As a company, we really want to be frontrunners, and a certificate helps to create a mindset in the organisation to do more to reduce CO2. The 5-step system allows a company to grow in its CO2 ambitions and at its own pace, and that actually makes it very accessible. And it also stimulates cooperation with chain partners. And at a moment like that, you are not looking for abstract stories, but you are looking for a concrete instrument that you can work with which you can show that it is meaningful and that it makes a difference. The most important success factor of the ladder is the fact that you get a fictitious discount on the tender. That is an important aspect for both contracting authorities and contractors.
So we had an example there about the CO2 performance ladder. Ashraf, in some of your work, you've been in this procurement space a little bit. What do you think is the value, or how have you experienced kind of procurement playing a role in enhancing circularity?
Through a project that I manage since 4 years and will last for more 2.5 years, funded by the German Ministry of the Environment, is related to, let's say, net zero emissions in the building sector. And to make it easy, we choose to work for the newly constructed projects. Not neglecting the existing, but rather to go further to a quick achievement on the newly constructed building. We issued a tool, a web-based tool called BitTool, Building Energy Performance Tool, based on the European Union tool that had been Egyptianized to work with the local conditions and the local materials, and to achieve a fund from let's say, a supporting bank like EBRD or the Central Bank of Egypt, something like this, you have to pass through this tool. It has been simplified, but it takes the process further towards the procurement. What will be the qualification of the contractors? Of course, it's our enemy to achieve something related to having the environment in a good way and the quality of living, because they tend to use the business as usual, because this is the way they run the business for quite some years, and they know how to make money with it. And any new idea or any new technology or system, it's totally opposed by them, but they are trying to simplify this issue for the owner and for the contractor and for the consultant to work with this BIP tool. For the procurement, we are now issuing a legislation in the Parliament that each new contract or procurement procedure must have a certain amount of CO2 reduction in the process, and the contractor, the consultant, and the owner has to prove that beforehand that they will achieve this kind of reduction to be eligible to apply for this fund. And of course, part of it's non-refundable fund, so it's promising. It's a kind of incentive, just to make the process goes. Hopefully, we will achieve something by the end of this year as a first draft for this act to be applied. And once it's applied, then we will have the main challenge for the existing buildings.
That's great. That's great to hear. Different types of projects going on clearly in this space.
Yes, it's massive development work in Egypt since 7 years.
Yeah. Roland, from a business perspective, how do you think the example Ashraf just shared, or in the video that we saw, how do you think businesses would be responding to having these type of KPIs or just tools to help bridge this gap between circular economy happening in the built environment more?
Yes, thank you. And absolutely, business welcomes that very much. May I quickly react to something that was said before about the lack of a vision? And I completely agree with you we need to get to a system where we don't just measure per square meter, but probably per person on this planet. What is actually our budget that we can use? There's a really interesting philosophy. It's not because I'm Swiss, but it is a Swiss thing that was started with the 2000 watt society. It's a philosophy that every human being has a right to use 2000 watt in terms of the energy that's available. And that is a design principle for neighborhoods, for whole cities, and it's exactly that system approach. So how do we design so that we all can live to that? For Europe, it means we have to come down because we're using way too much, but there's many countries where actually energy use is much lower because people are living in informal housing. So I think as a design principle, we absolutely need such a vision on how do we do that holistically. But also, just to come back to legislation, but also procurement, as you say, I think these have all been excellent examples that we've seen. The Finnish example, I'd like to add the example from Denmark, introducing absolute benchmarks and targets per square meter. It is per square meter, but that really drives the industry. I think in your charts that you showed before, we've just done a report early this year where we show if we look at things holistically, we can absolutely reduce construction emissions by 50% today. We just need to do it. We need to focus on it, really looking at it from a holistic perspective. And in that context, procurement is probably the even bigger driver than legislation. I think legislation needs to bring everyone up, but procurement is public, procurement is private, and if every organization out there that is procuring buildings or any type of project has a policy in the first place, starts looking at what are benchmarks out there, how can we incentivize our suppliers to actually work to that benchmark or even beat it. You can simply ask for alternative bids that are cost neutral. You incentivize your construction company. They may not like it in the first place, but they will realize if I don't do it, my competitor will do it. And so this is how we can really create then a race to better performance. So I think procurement is probably well, I'm having a private sector hat on, so I think there's so much we can already do. We don't need to wait for legislation, but it's of course then the legislation that will help bring everybody up to the same level. And that's why these examples that we've seen, I wish the CO2 ladder, the Danish benchmarks and the Finnish approach, they would somehow all come together and that countries look at this, how can we adapt these things in our own country to really help the whole sector improve.
It gets back to, again, that what's that goal collectively that we're trying to achieve, right? Great. We only have a couple of minutes left.
Sorry.
And no, that's great. And I wanted to get a bit of a sense from all of you, because you all have brilliant ideas and from very different perspectives. So we have a group of people here who represent all sorts of different sectors, probably have an interest in the built environment. I'm thinking if I could hear from each of you very briefly, within 1 or 2 sentences, what would you like this crowd to take away from today? Potentially even a very practical thing that you'd like to see them do next week when they're back at their desks, potentially, or speaking to other members in their organizations. Could be about, you know, let's procure in a certain way, Roland. But yeah, Ashraf, maybe you can go first.
Okay. To be briefly, that change is coming toward the environment. So go rapidly and take a position. Otherwise, you will be out of the game. This is what I'm saying to the contractors.
That's excellent. Roland.
Join us in the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. It's my other hat, co-chair of the steering committee. We're actually this week also here in Helsinki for our global assembly. And we're very happy that with Finland, we have decided that the whole work on sustainable buildings and construction and circularity will also be housed in the Global ABC in this new Circularity and Materials Hub. So if there is one global place where we're working on a common vision and how can we all do this together, please join us there. Thank you.
Thanks. Aishwarya.
I believe that one of the things I think that are really interesting and need to be taken away is that we consider saving the environment and the ecology always as an other thing. We need to realize that we are a part of the environment, we are a part of the ecology. The buildings that we're building are helping us interface with that, and every person through the life cycle of the building that is a stakeholder or is interacting with the building needs to keep that in mind. So policymakers need to create that sort of environment where people feel that ownership, but also that relationship with the built environment. And I feel like if we were just more compassionate about extracting resources and thinking about all of that as something that is directly taking away from the environment that we're a part of, this whole problem would be a lot easier to solve.
Yeah, I wish we could have a whole panel just on that. That's a really interesting point. Julia.
Well, I think that sort of the grander things have been said, so I will say something more specific on the space use agenda. I think this idea of what we presented, like a dense yet balanced built environment, like a place to live that is dense enough to have all the services, you can call it the 15-minute neighborhood, but still nature close enough, still has the space so that you don't feel crammed in. And I live in central London, so I know how that feels. There are a few amazing examples, but they're few. Right? Usually you have the tiny apartment and something you want to move out of, or then you have like a single family home that is usually quite space inefficient. So these things in between. So where I'm getting is like, if you walk around and you see great examples where space is used really well, but it's still really high quality of life, either let me know or let whoever know who you think has some influence on this, be it like your urban planning or like the developer you talk to or so on, because I think again to the vision of how that looks like living in such a space and how attractive that can be is still nascent.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and sharing your views. Big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. Right, we're coming towards the end of the session. I'm going to pass over the mic to the Minister of Environment from the Netherlands to make some closing words. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting panel discussion, I have to say. And I heard a lot that is relevant, and I'm sure that people will take a lot of the messages that you've given us home and try to act upon it. And as a member of the Dutch government, it's been very interesting for me to learn about the Finnish initiative for the Land Use and Building Act. And it shows that governments can also use a range of tools to encourage circularity in the construction sector. And clearly we can learn a lot from each other's best practices. I think it was just said that it would be nice to co-join a lot of different national systems together to have one perfect system. And of course that also is an extra motivation to see how we can set European standards at least, and in the end hopefully some more global standards. When it comes to public procurement, I think this point was also made by the panel. It is very important to take your responsibility as a government, I have to say, because if, in the Netherlands, the public procurement budget is about 80 billion per year, and I have taken the initiative to make all national departments, but also provinces and municipalities sign a climate and resilient structure procurement document. And this is very important because it means that when the government does projects, it also means that they have to see if it is climate resilient and whether the procurement is circular. And that goes from buildings to bridges to chairs, so it's quite considerable. And then Julia, you also mentioned the importance of infrastructure when constructing new building areas. And this is something that we also try to do from the Dutch government side. We had 7.5 billion for infrastructure for the creation of infrastructure surrounding new housing projects. And we made sure to really do it in a very integrated way, not only focusing on roads, but also focusing on cycling and public transport, because people are using the space in a different way nowadays. And if you have good public transport, good cycling facilities, we're Dutch in the end, then it also helps in creating space for other activities than just having a lot of roads. I think it was a very valuable point that we can all take along. I've also been very inspired to hear about the private initiative in South Africa for using circular bio-based solutions in new buildings. And of course, the CO2 performance ladder is an example of a best practice, and I hope that it inspires others to also look into that system. There is an intense demand for new infrastructures and buildings in the global south, and it's vital that they are constructed using bio-based and green materials and other materials that can be reused after their first lifespan. And in fact, the global south offers virtually unlimited opportunities for sustainable circular construction of buildings and infrastructure from the ground up. And besides bio-based and recyclable materials, circular design is another area with great potential. And in other words, structures can be designed in such a way that they can be taken apart later on again, and their parts can be refurbished for use in new structures. By contrast, much of the building stock we need in the global north already exists. It means that we have to focus on reusing existing materials and rethinking our current building stock can meet our future needs and redesigning our built environment accordingly. As we saw in the presentation by the keynote speakers, Europe's built environment is spatially inefficient and also imbalanced. And here too, I see a lot of opportunities to boost the efficiency of existing buildings, which in turn will improve the livability and the livability of neighborhoods. So this session was very valuable in my opinion, and I would like to thank everyone who contributed. And finally, I also would like to share you for sharing all your enthusiasm on this important topic. The built environment offers a lot of scope for speeding up the transition to a circular economy and for a truly sustainable future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you on my behalf as well. Thank you to all the panelists, all our speakers, and all of you for attending. This isn't the last time that you can talk here at this forum or hear people talking about the built environment. There's a number of accelerator sessions happening tomorrow on building a circular environment, accelerating the transition towards a circular built environment, our shared understanding, and the local approach. You can find out more about these all on the app. Before we close, I just wanted to end with a video that we've just produced with our partners at Arup, looking a little bit at what Julia actually presented earlier, the Circular Buildings Toolkit, so giving some practical solutions for how to do circularity in the built environment. Thank you on my behalf as well, and have a nice day.
The world has woken up to the climate crisis, the effects of which are already being felt. One of the largest contributors is the built environment. To realize a net zero and nature-positive future, the building industry needs to reduce the impact its demand for products and materials is having on the planet. The circular economy is critical to achieving net zero, as well as reducing the use of virgin materials, capturing long-term value, increasing resilience, reducing waste, and creating new economic opportunities. So, how can we realize the benefits that the circular economy has to offer? A framework built around 4 principles is designed to help the building industry tackle global challenges at every stage of a project's lifespan. Build only what you need. Do we need a brand new building? Instead, we can reuse, adapt, or transform existing buildings to meet future needs. Quay Quarter Tower in Sydney was built around an existing core, retaining 68% of the original structure, reducing the requirement for new materials, which saved 12,000 tons of carbon and $130 million. Build with the right materials. When we do build, we should use renewable, bio-based materials, or those with a lower embodied carbon. We should track and set targets around material use, collecting data through material passports, which allow them to be recovered and reused in the future. Build efficiently. There are opportunities to save carbon and cut waste with every decision, no matter how small. Designers for One Triton Square in London adopted a marginal gains approach, analysing every system and component to maximise performance, resulting in a saving of 40,000 tonnes of carbon and a 43% reduction in costs. Build for long-term value. Buildings don't last forever, but their parts can be reused. Brummen Town Hall in the Netherlands was designed to be dismantled after 20 years. Selecting prefabricated timber components and avoiding difficult-to-recycle materials allowed for 90% of the original building to be reused, turning it into a material bank for the construction of future buildings. The building industry needs to adopt a circular mindset across the entire project lifespan. Through strong leadership, collaboration, innovative circular business models, and digital technology, we can transform the industry and achieve a net zero and nature-positive future. Search for the Circular Buildings Toolkit.